Have you ever wondered why nearly every country on Earth, from mighty economic powers to small developing nations, is drowning in trillions of dollars in national debt? Is it reckless spending or something far more strategic? In today's world, where trust creates money, public debt is not just a number. It's a mirror reflecting how nations operate, respond to crises, and invest in their future. This video will not only help you understand why the world is always in debt, but reveal the opportunities, the power, and the mindset needed to turn that debt into long-term prosperity. This isn't about fear. It's about understanding. Imagine a nation as a massive ship sailing through the global economic ocean. To stay afloat and navigate, it needs fuel, education, healthcare, infrastructure. But when tax revenue isn't enough, it borrows. That's national debt. Don't fear the word debt like it's a curse. In modern economics, borrowing isn't weakness, it's flexibility. It's a tool for growth when wielded correctly. Debt allows governments to respond, build, and adapt. When used wisely, it's not a burden, it's a lever of prosperity. Understanding this distinction is the first step to mastering financial thinking at a national level. National debt, also called government debt, sovereign debt, or public debt, is the total amount a central government owes. It doesn't include personal loans, credit cards, or state-level debts like California's or Texas's. Only the federal-level obligations count. Understanding this distinction clarifies who holds the responsibility. National debt is like a country's mortgage, just on a massive scale. And just like in personal finance, borrowing isn't inherently bad. It's how and why it's borrowed that matters. This is the foundation of understanding how the largest economies in the world function. Let go of the idea that only poor countries have debt. Even the wealthiest nations in the world owe trillions. Debt doesn't equal weakness. It can signal ambition, investment, or even trust. Governments use debt to fund progress and respond to public needs. The issue isn't whether a country owes money. The issue is whether it can manage that debt with intelligence, transparency, and vision. In this light, debt becomes less of a financial prison and more of a powerful engine, if managed well. In the financial world, national debt is a pillar that supports global markets. When citizens, banks, and investors purchase government bonds, they're not just lending money, they're lending trust. Bonds are seen as safe, stable, and foundational investments. In that sense, debt becomes a currency of confidence. It's a sign that people believe a country will repay and thrive. Understanding this subtle relationship helps us see why debt, when properly structured, can reinforce rather than undermine national strength. Borrowing allows governments to act in crises, build infrastructure, and provide essential services. But like any powerful tool, debt must be used with discipline. It can build bridges to prosperity or create holes too deep to escape. Mastering national debt isn't about fearing it. It's about learning how it works and how it's wielded. To understand national debt is to understand one of the most powerful levers in modern economics. One of the most common questions is, if governments can print money, why do they need to borrow? The answer lies in one dangerous word: inflation. Printing endless money is like pouring gasoline on a fire. It inflates prices, devalues currency, and destroys economic trust. Venezuela and Zimbabwe are examples of what happens when this power is abused. Borrowing, on the other hand, keeps governments financially disciplined. Debt comes with responsibility, repayment, and accountability. It's a structured tool, not a blank check. That's why even the most powerful nations still choose to borrow rather than recklessly print. The first reason countries borrow is to cover budget deficits. Think of a country like a giant household. It has bills to pay: education, healthcare, infrastructure. When tax revenue falls short of these costs, governments must borrow to keep vital systems running. They can't just pause operations. Deficits are inevitable, especially in times of economic slowdown. Debt becomes a temporary bridge that allows the government to meet its obligations without cutting off essential services or overwhelming taxpayers. In these moments, borrowing isn't a choice. It's a necessity to preserve stability and social order. Raising taxes sounds simple in theory, but politically, it's a landmine. Higher taxes can trigger public outrage, hurt consumption, and stall economic growth. On the other hand, cutting public spending may lead to underfunded hospitals, poor education, and failing infrastructure, all of which create long-term damage. So borrowing becomes the least disruptive short-term solution. It buys time, maintains trust, and keeps services flowing. But here's the catch: what's easiest isn't always what's best. Debt can't be a habit, it must be a strategy. Otherwise, the future gets mortgaged to avoid present discomfort. Another powerful reason governments borrow is to invest in long-term development. Imagine trying to build highways or hospitals only when there's surplus money. It would take decades. Borrowing allows governments to act now, not later. These investments create jobs, improve public well-being, and stimulate economic activity. A road built today increases productivity tomorrow. A school built today educates leaders of the next generation. In this context, debt becomes a launchpad for prosperity. Used correctly, it pays for itself by boosting GDP and tax revenue. It's not just spending, it's a bet on the country's potential. Third, borrowing is crucial in times of crisis. Pandemics, wars, natural disasters, they don't wait for balanced budgets. When chaos strikes, governments must act fast. Take the 2020 pandemic. The U.S. borrowed over $3.8 trillion to issue stimulus checks, save businesses, and stabilize the economy. Without that swift borrowing, millions would have lost jobs, homes, and healthcare. Emergencies demand immediate liquidity, and debt provides it. In such cases, borrowing isn't just financial, it's humanitarian. It's how leaders respond, protect, and rebuild when the storm hits. Governments also borrow to refinance existing debt. Sounds odd? Not really. Individuals do it all the time, taking out a lower interest loan to pay off an old one. This tactic is called rolling over debt. It helps manage cash flow and extend payment timelines. As long as the country has credibility and access to lenders, refinancing is a legitimate strategy. But if that trust erodes, the rollover becomes a death spiral. Managing old debt with new debt isn't wrong. It's how it's done that matters. Fiscal trust is the fuel that keeps this engine running. Lastly, debt is used as a macroeconomic tool to regulate inflation and interest rates. When inflation is too high, issuing government bonds can absorb excess money from the economy. When growth is sluggish, borrowing more can inject funds, stimulate demand, and revive momentum. In this way, debt becomes more than just a financial tool. It becomes a steering wheel for national economic policy. It's a balance between speed and safety, risk and reward. Used wisely, it can prevent recessions, curb overheating, and guide a nation towards steady, sustainable growth. Have you ever wondered, who's wealthy enough to lend trillions of dollars to entire countries? The answer might surprise you. It's not a single billionaire or secretive megabank. In reality, governments borrow from three primary sources: domestic lenders, foreign entities, and their own central banks. Each source has different motivations. Some seek profit, some stability, others trust. But what they all have in common is this: they believe the country will repay. Debt, in this context, is not a cry for help, it's a signal of credibility. When nations borrow, they're not just seeking funds, they're leveraging global trust. The first and most common lender? The country's own people. Citizens can lend money to their government by purchasing bonds, essentially IOUs that pay interest over time. Government bonds are among the safest investments, often used by pension funds, banks, and individuals alike. These are long-term instruments of trust. When people buy bonds, they're not just earning returns, they're supporting national stability. Banks, investment funds, and even insurance companies heavily invest in government bonds to diversify their portfolios. This internal ecosystem keeps capital flowing within the country and reinforces the financial link between citizens and their government. A significant portion of national debt is held by other government agencies. Yes, governments often borrow from themselves. Surplus funds from programs like Social Security or public pension systems are invested in government bonds. This is called intragovernmental debt. It's not fake or circular, it's strategic. These agencies earn interest which helps them fulfill their own obligations. It's a way to grow public money safely, while ensuring the government has access to cash when needed. At times, this type of debt can account for trillions in a national balance sheet, silently sustaining the government from the inside. Next comes the foreign market, lenders from outside the country. Foreign individuals, commercial banks, and even entire governments invest in another nation's bonds, especially those from economically stable nations like the United States. Why? Because it's a low-risk, interest-generating asset. China and Japan, for example, own hundreds of billions in U.S. Treasury bonds. But for weaker economies, it's not so easy. Investors are less willing to lend to countries they don't trust. When a nation lacks credibility, borrowing becomes difficult and expensive. Debt, in this context, is earned privilege, not entitlement. For countries with limited access to global capital markets, institutions like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, ADB, and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, become key lenders. The World Bank and ADB provide long-term development loans for infrastructure, energy, and education projects, usually at lower interest rates. The IMF, however, acts as a financial emergency room. When nations face economic collapse, the IMF steps in with loans tied to strict reforms, higher taxes, lower spending, and structural overhauls. These conditions can spark public unrest, but without them, economic survival may be impossible. It's a double-edged sword. Lastly, central banks, governments' own monetary arms, can fund deficits by purchasing their country's bonds. This process is known as debt monetization. Technically, the central bank prints money and lends it back to the government. While powerful, this approach risks inflation and currency devaluation. That's why modern central banks typically buy bonds indirectly from the open market, not directly from the Treasury. These purchases are used to influence interest rates and money supply. Central banks, then, are not mere lenders. They are guardians of monetary stability, using debt as a scalpel, not a hammer. National debt isn't automatically a villain. In fact, it can be a powerful force for good, when used correctly. When governments borrow to build hospitals, roads, or schools, they're not just spending, they're investing in their people, in long-term productivity, and in national resilience. This kind of debt is constructive, forward-thinking, and growth-oriented. It sets the foundation for higher GDP, more tax revenue, and a better quality of life. So before we criticize debt, we must ask, what is it funding? Debt that fuels development isn't a burden, it's a bridge to a better future. But like any tool, debt has a dark side when misused. When governments borrow just to repay old loans or to fund unnecessary spending, debt turns from a bridge into a trap. This cycle, borrowing to pay interest, can spiral quickly. Eventually, interest payments consume budgets that should go to schools, healthcare, or infrastructure. Investors grow uneasy, interest rates rise, and a debt crisis looms. It's not the amount of debt that causes collapse, it's the lack of strategy. Debt without purpose is dangerous. It erodes trust, inflates risk, and weakens a nation's ability to govern effectively. One key measure of healthy debt is the debt-to-GDP ratio. This compares a country's total debt to its annual economic output. A 60% ratio is often seen as a safe benchmark. If a nation produces $100 billion in GDP, a $60 billion debt is manageable. But this isn't a hard rule. Japan has a ratio over 200%, yet thrives due to low interest rates and high investor confidence. Meanwhile, weaker countries may default at 70%. What matters most is credibility. Investors don't just lend based on math, they lend based on belief. Trust is the true currency. To limit overspending, some countries like the US set a debt ceiling, a legal cap on how much the government can borrow. In theory, this creates fiscal responsibility. In practice, it's often raised to avoid shutdowns. Why? Because halting government services is politically toxic. This paradox shows us something important. Flexibility matters. Rigid rules don't always reflect economic reality. Managing debt isn't just about numbers, it's about balancing law, politics, markets, and people's needs. Smart debt policy requires both structure and room to adapt. So, is national debt good or bad? The answer is, it depends. Debt can be a catalyst for progress or a warning sign of decay. If it funds future growth, it's smart. If it feeds short-term waste, it's reckless. Like fire, debt can warm or burn. It's all about who's holding the torch. What defines a strong nation isn't how much it owes, but how wisely it borrows, how clearly it communicates, and how effectively it converts borrowed capital into lasting value. In the end, debt is not a flaw, it's a responsibility. At first glance, a debt-free country sounds like a dream. No burdens, no interest payments, no obligations. But in reality, not a single sovereign country on earth is entirely debt-free. In today's financial world, debt isn't a sign of failure. It's part of how modern economies function. Governments borrow to build, to stabilize, and to invest. The goal isn't zero debt, it's sustainable, strategic debt. The healthiest economies don't eliminate borrowing, they master it. In the global economy, debt is like oxygen, essential when managed, deadly when denied or abused. Macau is often cited as the rare example of a debt-free region. But here's the catch: it's not a sovereign country. It's a special administrative region of China, with a small population, a tiny geographic footprint, and an economy fueled by gambling revenues larger than Las Vegas. This model isn't scalable to large nations. You can't turn the United States into a giant casino to pay off the national debt. Each country has a unique financial structure, and large-scale economies require more complex funding systems, of which debt is an integral part. Eliminating national debt would require extreme and painful choices: massive cuts to public spending, sharp tax hikes, or abolishing government bonds altogether. These solutions could lead to civil unrest, economic slowdown, and market instability. Because government bonds aren't just a borrowing tool, they're a safe investment vehicle relied upon by pension funds, insurance companies, and millions of savers. Removing them would eliminate one of the world's most trusted low-risk assets. A debt-free country might sound pure, but it comes at a high cost, one that few, if any, can afford. The real question isn't, can a country be debt-free, but can it control its debt intelligently? A mature nation understands how to leverage borrowing, how to allocate it wisely, and how to build systems that pay it back through growth. True freedom doesn't mean escaping debt, it means mastering it. In a world built on trust and capital flows, responsible debt management is a badge of strength, not shame. When used wisely, debt becomes not a chain, but a compass, pointing a country toward innovation, progress, and resilience. A country defaulting on its debt isn't just an economic hiccup. It's a full-blown national emergency. When a government cannot repay what it owes, confidence vanishes overnight. Investors flee, currency collapses, imports become unaffordable, supermarket shelves go empty, fuel runs dry, chaos ensues. Default isn't only about numbers, it's about people. Jobs are lost, savings are wiped out, social programs crumble, national credit ratings plummet, and rebuilding trust takes years, sometimes decades. Unlike a business, a country can't declare bankruptcy and start over. It must survive in crisis mode, managing fallout with fewer options and immense public pressure. The cost is societal. Sri Lanka's 2022 default was a sobering example. The country owed over $50 billion in external debt, but couldn't meet repayments. The result? Mass protests, power shortages, food crises, and a government in collapse. Default didn't just wreck the economy, it tore at the nation's soul. People demanded answers. Corruption was exposed, leadership was questioned, and recovery became a long, uncertain road. What caused it? Years of overspending, weak fiscal policy, and a breakdown in trust. A default never erupts suddenly. It builds quietly, gradually, until the system cracks. And when it does, the pain is swift, deep, and widespread. Unlike corporations, nations don't disappear after defaulting. They continue, but with heavier burdens and fewer choices. A default isn't just a debt crisis, it's a crisis of leadership, discipline, and public trust. Public debt, in itself, is not the enemy. It is like a double-edged sword, harmless in a steady hand, but destructive in reckless ones. When wielded with wisdom, debt fuels progress, funds innovation, and provides lifelines in moments of crisis. But when misused, it becomes a trap, a symptom of short-sighted governance. The key lies not in avoiding debt, but in mastering it. Debt must serve a vision, one that elevates the people, strengthens the economy, and prepares the nation for future shocks. In this light, managing public debt becomes an act of leadership, discipline, and long-term thinking. Just like in personal life, financial leverage is a tool that helps us break through present limitations and reach for the future. But it only works when we fully understand its nature, control it, and use it at the right time. A mature nation doesn't avoid debt. It confronts it with courage, plans wisely, and transforms it into a force for progress. In a world where money is trust, managing debt is ultimately about managing trust, and that is a national mission. National debt isn't a curse, it's a reflection of how a country thinks, leads, and invests. When used wisely, debt becomes a springboard for innovation, resilience, and growth. When abused, it signals decline. The world doesn't need debt-free nations. It needs nations that understand debt, respect its power, and use it to elevate society. As citizens, we must grasp this truth to hold leaders accountable. As leaders, we must embrace this responsibility with clarity and courage, because in the end, strength isn't measured by how little you owe, but by how well you turn debt into value.